In this video, we're going to be looking at the domain of a function. So, if we've got something like this, well, first of all, is it a function? When it's presented in this form, I'm just looking to see if there's any repetition of first entries, and there's not. The one's not repeated as a first entry anywhere. Neither is -1 repeated. 2 is not repeated as a first entry anywhere, so it's perfectly fine. This is a function. Another way I can see it is to be written like that, and I can see that there's each thing in the domain only is assigned to one thing in the range. So when you've got it in this form and you're asked for the domain, it's very easy to read it off. If it was in this form, the domain is just going to be the set of first entries. If it's in this form, the domain is just the set of elements as listed here. Okay, so that's easy. What if your function is defined with a formula? So we need a definition, a proper definition now. The domain of a function f is the set of all x values that are allowed. Okay. Well, when do you run into restrictions? Well, if you have a fraction is not allowed to have its denominator equal to 0. It can't happen. You can't have the fraction 5 over 0. And what happens if you try and do that? You get an error message. Okay, you tried to divide by 0, you had 0 in the denominator. You can't have that in a fraction. Okay, so if we have something like this, okay, if f of x, let me focus that, is equal to 24 over x minus 5, what is the domain? Well, the domain of a function is the set of all x values that are allowed. Okay, what is x not allowed to be here? And don't say 0. The denominator is not allowed to be 0. So in this case, that wasn't allowed. It's always true. The denominator is not allowed to be 0. So where do you get in trouble here? If x is equal to what? If x is equal to 5. So there's a lot of confusion about, in the beginning, about that definition. You cannot have 0 in the denominator. The domain is what x is allowed to be. So in this particular function, x is not allowed to be 5, because if x is 5, it makes the denominator 0. So what's the domain? The domain is what x is allowed to be. So x can be anything as long as it's not equal to 5, or any real number except 5. Okay. What about a number line? You've all seen the number line, haven't you? So if I could express the domain as a number line, it would be this. See how 5 is left out, but everything else is applied? Or I could do it in interval form. And what is interval form? X is anything except 5. Well, x can go from -infinity up to, but not including 5. And then anything bigger than 5. And if you don't know interval form, you must reacquaint yourself with it. Okay, what you cannot do is say, I'm not going to worry about interval form, I'm just going to write everything up like this. Well, multiple choice, and if your correct answer looks like that, you're going to have to know that that's the form you need to choose. So all of these say the same thing. All of these are correct answers. You must know how to write all of them. Okay, so the domain is the set of x values that are allowed. If this is my function f, x is not allowed to be 5, but that's the only thing that gets you into trouble. So x can be anything, any real number, as long as it's not 5. That is my domain. What's the domain for that? Well, this is where you're factoring. You have to know how to factor to be in Math 140, and you're going to have to factor to answer this correctly. So what do we have here? This is a fraction. I'm not allowed to have 0 as the denominator, but we should also recognize we can factor this. What do they have in common? What does this term and this term have in common? They have an x in common, and what are we left with if I remove an x, if I factor it out? I'm left with that. Okay, if you have no idea how you got from there to there, then it's going to be very difficult for you to pass Math 140. You already need to know how to do that to be in here. Okay, now, what is the domain? The domain is the set of x values that are allowed. Where do we get in trouble here? Well, the denominator is not allowed to be 0. And so for this one, we can see we get in trouble if x is 3, but we also get in trouble if x is 0. If x is 3, then what's inside the parentheses is 0, and so the whole thing's 0. If x is 0, then it's multiplied by that, the whole thing's 0. So these are not allowed. X is not allowed to be 0, and x is not allowed to be 3. So what's the domain? The domain is the set of all x values such that x is not equal to 0 and x is not equal to 3. It can be anything except 0 or 3. If we were going to show that on the number line, we would leave the 0 and the 3 out. But anything else that's in the black is just fine. And finally, if this was in interval notation, what's the domain? Any real number as long as it's not 0 and it's not 3. So I like to do these underneath the number line because if you read that from left to right, we come from negative infinity up to but not including 0. You have to jump over 0. Then it can be anything in between 0 and 3. And then anything bigger than 3. So all 3 of those are correct. They're just in different forms. You must know how to do all different forms. You can't just say, I'm going to give the answer like this, and I'm not going to worry about that, because if it's multiple choice, you'd have to recognize that it's in that form. Okay. What about the domain of this? That's a fraction. Again, the assumed knowledge test, you have to know how to factor that, because we have a fraction. Domain, the denominator is not allowed to be 0. So all of that is not allowed to be 0. You can't see what x is restricted to unless you factor it. For this one, it needs that trick. I have x squared by itself. Are there two numbers that multiply together to give us positive 10, but at the same time they add up together to give us negative 7? And there are two numbers that work. And the two numbers that work are negative 5 and negative 2. Negative 5 times negative 2 is positive 10, and negative 5 plus negative 2 is negative 7. So I can factor it like that. Now, if you don't factor it, if you can't factor it, you can't see what the restrictions are. Now that I've rewritten it, where do we get in trouble? We get in trouble if x is 5 or if x is 2. So those two values are not allowed. What is the domain? The domain is everything that is allowed. So the domain is going to be any real number. X is any real number as long as, so that straight line is shorthand for as long as, it's not 5 and it's not 2. Okay, so again, if this was on a number line, we would have everything except 2 and 5. And if the answer was given in interval form, everything except 2 and 5 would be expressed like that. So these are three different answers, correct, in different form for the domain. Okay, where else do we have restrictions? Well, we have restrictions with roots. An even root is not allowed to have a negative number on the inside, and the inside of a root is called the argument. So if I have a square root, if we do the square root of 6, that's fine and dandy. What's in the argument is 6. 6 is not negative, so that is just fine, and I can check that. If I try and do the square root of 6, it's fine. What about the square root of 0? Okay, what you have to remember here, and it's extremely important, 0 is not a negative number. 0 is neither negative nor positive. If I want to do the square root of 0, that does exist. The square root of 0 is 0. So that is fine and dandy. It's okay. But if I try and take the square root of negative 4, well, an even root, a square root, a fourth root, etc., is not allowed to have the argument being negative. And the argument here is negative 4. And if I try and do that in my calculator, I get an error. Okay, so what happens if my domain is this? If my function is this, the square root of x minus 5. Okay, what is allowed? Well, the inside here cannot be negative. It's not allowed to be negative. So what is it allowed to be? And don't say it's allowed to be positive. That's not correct. What does not negative mean? It means it can be 0 or it can be positive. So whatever is inside the argument, the entire argument, has to be greater than or equal to 0. It's allowed to be 0. And believe me, if you don't get that straight, you're going to miss a very important multiple choice test, because they'll give the answer with it like that. Now, we're not done yet. The domain is the set of x values that are allowed. This isn't telling me what x is allowed to be. This is telling me x minus 5 is allowed to be something. So I have to get x by itself. How do I get x by itself? I add 5 to both sides. Is adding 5, will that change the direction of the arrow? No, it won't. So I have x is greater than or equal to 5. That is my domain. Another way I could write that, well, on the number line, I include 5 because of the symbol greater than or equal to 5. So 5 and everything to the right. And how would I write that in interval form? Well, 5 is included, so I start at and include 5, so I have to write it with that square bracket. So these are 3 different correct answers for the domain. Okay, what about this guy? What is the domain for this guy? That's what I want you to do on your test. So I can't write it with a square root symbol, so on your quiz, I'll have it written like that. Okay, so I want you to tell me what the domain is in interval form. And finally, what's the domain for this? Well, what do we have here? We have 2 restrictions. Okay, we have a fraction. So because this is a fraction, whatever's in the bottom is not allowed to be 0. That means x minus 5 is not allowed to be 0. Because what's the square root of 0? It's 0. That's one restriction, because it's a fraction. But now, because that is a square root, then we have what's inside has to be greater than or equal to 0. So x is greater than or equal to 5. That's my restriction because it's a square root. I have to put those together. Okay, so x minus 5 is not allowed to be 0. X is not allowed to be 5. So I have x is not allowed to be 5, but at the same time, x is greater than or equal to 5. The only way I can put those together is x is strictly greater than 5. So I have to have x is greater than or equal to 5, but I also have to have the restriction x is not equal to 5. So the only thing that puts those 2 together is that. Okay, so I had 2 restrictions here. So that's my answer for this one. So notice, so If it's in number line form, it would look like that. That would be the domain. Or if it's in interval form, it would be like that. So all three of these are correct answers in different forms. Now notice the difference between this F and this H. It's very important that you notice the difference, because if you don't get the difference correct, if you don't understand the difference, the symbol is going to matter here. So after the restrictions, this is what I'm left with on that. And I can guarantee you, if this was a multiple choice question, they would ask you, that would be the correct answer, and something like that would be bogus for this one. Okay, I'm going to stop it there.